Welcome to the Pork and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Pui Lan. In today's episode, I'm going to interview my friend, Professor Joerg Rieger of Vanderbilt University, to talk about Christ and Empire, a book that he has written 18 years ago, as well as the relationship between theology and class and economics. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Prilan. I look forward to our conversation.
I have taught your book, Christ and Empire, many times, and many people have consulted it. You wrote it 18 years ago. If you are to revisit the book again, will you add something or change something?
Maybe first what I learned. So the book was about 2,000 years of Christianity and how empires over 2,000 years shaped the way we do theology. In this case, shaped the way we talk and think about Christ. And what I found is it really makes a difference, right? We start with Paul, there's the Roman Empire, then we go through various other empires up to the present. Keep in mind that the book was written during the presidency of George W. Bush, where a lot of people were talking about empire. The point of the book, of course, is not negative. I wanted to show how there's a problem with empire and Christian thought. But the real argument was to show that at every stage, empire cannot take over completely. Christianity produces alternatives. These alternatives keep making a difference. And so while the empires faded, the resistance continues. That to me is the encouraging message. And that still stands. Where I continued working over these years is the present. Back then, I called the present the post-colonial empire, which is an empire after the end of the great colonialisms that many people are fully aware of. The question is, how does empire manifest itself once the big colonial structures are gone? And at that point, I really started thinking about the flow of capital, the flow of power that is more difficult to see in a system where you might not have a viceroy and a governor and all these other machines, but soft power perhaps sometimes. So that was the big question. And for me, that's the ongoing research. How are we shaped all the way to the core? I define empire in the book as a conglomerate of powers that seek to shape everything. So empire here is not just a matter of politics and economics. It's also a matter of culture, shaping religion, shaping our affects, shaping us all the way as people, as relationships, and so on. I've continued the investigation, and I think I'm clearer now about empire, perhaps, than I've ever been. And of course, a lot of people notice empire again now with the current US administration. But my point is, don't be too quick just looking at one issue. There's a much bigger system, and we have to deal with that.
You have worked for several years on Capitalocene. Can you tell us what this means?
Yes, so this is my latest book, Theology in the Capitalocene is the title, and the subtitle, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. And what I realized is there's something very complex that's shaping us these days. Many people talk about the Anthropocene, and that oftentimes assumes that it is humanity, the sheer mass of 8 billion, 9 billion human beings shaping the fate and the future of the planet. Jason Moore, a colleague of mine, a sociologist and historian, initially coined the term in relation with others. Those of us who talk about the Capitalocene say it's not really all of humanity. It's not even the majority of humanity. There are some principalities and powers, to use wording from the Bible, that bus again all the way to the core. So the Capitalocene is this flow of money. Of course, there's individuals that are part of the story, but it's a system, and money and power go hand in hand. And again, like empire, in every time, they shape us all the way to the core. So this is not just a political and economic problem. Again, it's a cultural problem. It's an affective problem, and it's a religious problem. That's why I am dealing with the Capitalocene here, because it seems to me it affects us even if we don't know it. That's the problem with empire, right? It shapes you whether you like it or not. And these post-colonial Capitalocene empires are in some ways more dangerous because you see them less, perhaps, but they go deeper at the same time.
I wonder how you use the term post-colonial when you talk about Capitalocene. When you talk about post-colonial, Are you talking about, as you just mentioned, that is the former mechanisms of empire sending armies to rule over large territories, or a viceroy or governor to rule over places? That is no more, but you use post-colonial in that sense?
That's one sense, yes, in which I'm using it. Post-colonial here really means there's a new stage, a new period of history. The Capitalocene is talking about geological age. That's even bigger periods of history. But what I'm saying is that this is a moment in which the old colonial systems for Christianity that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire have folded, and we now have to deal with certain powers that we have to look at differently, engage differently. But of course, the other part of post-colonial, and I think post-colonial scholars have agreed on this for a long time, is to say, as soon as you have colonialism, you have post-colonialism, right? Because you always have resistance within colonialism. So I don't want to ignore that, but I want to make a historical argument saying the empire is shifting and we better have to pay attention.
You have always included class and economics in your theological reflection. Can you tell me why, and why is this important?
The first thing is really my argument that this post-colonial empire, in quotation marks, is an empire that's run more by economy than political structures. You could see this in U.S. history, where the U.S. has had some colonies, but the bigger U.S. impact was not through colonial governments, but through economic dealings. That has to be addressed. So in this sense, those of us, yourself included too, who are worried about colonialisms, neo-colonialisms, perhaps that's another word we could use, just have to take an account as to how these powers are actually governing us, how they're ruling us. And so this is one reason I've talked about the economy, because these things matter. So economy is not just about money. As a theologian, I don't feel a particular affinity to studying economics. But the reality is, if the economy is impinging, encroaching on my work as a theologian, I have to deal with. That's one reason why economics became important in my work. And that really happened after the Christ and Empire book. So Christ and Empire 2007, 2009, I published a book, No Rising Tide, Theology, Economics in the Future, because that was the next step for me to investigate this post-colonial empire. So that's going on. The class thing, I think, has to be discussed separately, because there's a lot of theologians, maybe not a lot, but a good number of theologians now that deal with the economy, but hardly anybody deals with class, right? It's almost like that's a taboo issue. Nobody wants to go there. People either are not even interested or they don't realize what it is. And of course, people think class is a matter of status or how much money you have and then what layer of the cake you're in. When I say class, I'm talking about a relationship of power. The point here is not just how much money you have, maybe not even that important, but what kind of power do you have over others? Who has power over you? And that happens again via the economy, but it's not limited to economic issues. In this sense, class as relationship again shapes the way you think. It shapes your identity. It shapes your religion. It has an impact on how race functions. It has an impact on how gender functions. So class here is always intersectional. Now, one more thing here that's crucial in this analysis. When you and I wrote the Occupy Religion book about the Occupy Wall Street movement, the notion of the 99%, one way to define that is to say the 99% are the ones that have to work for a living. And that's pretty interesting because 99% of us have to work for a living. And therefore, if you have to work for a living, there's a labor relationship, which is a class relationship. And you're spending so much time of your life at work that it would be very surprising if that didn't matter. What I'm saying is, these things matter. They shape us again all the way to the core. But now the interesting thing is when people say working class, they think it's white guys in blue overalls or white guys in hard hats. The working class, the 99%, if you want to extend the working class to everybody that has to work for a living, is the most diverse population that the world has ever seen. That's interesting in itself. So diversity is built into the class issue. And this is the place where we we then can negotiate our identities. This is the place where we're not just fighting economic oppression. This is a place where we can start fighting racism, where we can start fighting sexism. So in this sense, labor, class, those are relationships of exploitation. But what I'm saying also is those are places of resistance. And that's the exciting thing. So it's not just complaining about how tough our lives are or how little power we have, but it's also plotting about what can we do if we work together? What difference can we make?
Now, we collaborated on the book, Occupy Religion, as you said, talking about the Occupy Wall Street movement 14 years ago. And what do you think social movements should aim for, or how can we build such kind of cross-section of social movements again?
There's a new book by an American journalist who lives in Brazil, Vincent Bevins. The title is If We Burn: The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. And what Bevins is talking about is, 2010 and 2020, he says, is the period in world history where we had the most protests, the most mass protests that the world has ever seen. This is a global argument. It's not just about the US. He talks about Brazil, where he lives. He talks about the Arab Spring. He talks about Europe. He talks about the United States. The problem is that despite, and maybe, I don't know, because of all these protests, not a whole lot has changed. In fact, things have gotten worse. So Bevins' point is maybe we have to rethink protest movements. I think this is crucial. I often say to my students, this whole idea of speaking truth to power is fine, but you have to be prepared for the fact that you may have the truth, and at the end of the day, they still have the power. Protest movements, to me, are still important, but I think they're limited. We've seen this with the Occupy Wall Street movement as well. Instead, what we're trying to do, this is my work at Vanderbilt and the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice that I direct. We're thinking about how can social movements start building economic power? How can social movements pick up the fact that we're a very diverse conglomerate of people, 99% of us, that have to work for a living and that are not really running the show in the Capitalocene? What can we do to make a difference? That takes organizing, that takes bringing people together, that takes working through our differences. But it has some promise, because once you build this, economic power feeds back into political power and economic power feed back into religious power, and vice versa. Something is added to this world of politics and political theology and social movements that we're not seeing very clearly right now, especially not in theological studies. So this is what I'm saying here. The kind of social movements we see today need to deal with the fact that we're all workers now, and that this is something that on the one hand has to be taken into account as a problem, but also this is where we have our power. No boss could ever say only a dead worker is a good worker. So no matter how menial your labor, or you might not even have a formal job, you might be part of the informal economy, you might be a person with disabilities, that also works. But these are the places where I think we have some power. And so people that think political theology is what you do on a Wednesday night when you sit and talk to your group, that's fine. That has to go on. But I'm saying, why don't we tie this back into our everyday practices? Why don't we start building power at work, wherever we are, and then we tie these movements together? That, of course, means we now have to think about alternative forms of bringing working people together. One thing that's really interesting to us is worker-owned cooperatives. If somebody is looking for alternatives to capitalism, I would suggest take a look at worker-owned co-ops, where now you have economic democracy that you don't have anywhere else in capitalism. People have not just a fair deal, but they have a voice. They determine what's profit, what is done with the profit, how profit is produced, and so on. So this is a whole new world, and this is something via the Wendland-Cook Program in my work at Vanderbilt we're trying to bring more deeply into the conversation of faith communities.
I have read that in the 19th century, especially in England, there were people like F.D. Morris and others who also proposed cooperatives. And we criticize that they have not taken into social analysis and especially class analysis into their consideration, and it will not go very far. Why did you believe a workers' cooperative will work and will provide an alternative to capitalism?
First of all, I would say that whatever happens in the Capitalocene, so this has, of course, economic consequences, this has ecological consequences. None of this is natural. The system of capitalism is a way of controlling things from the perspective of capital. This is why capitalism and democracy don't go well together either. People think capitalism is democratic. It isn't. It is the rule of capital for the benefit of the shareholders. And there may be a shareholder democracy, but even among the shareholders, it's the one that holds the most shares. It's not one person, one vote. It's $1, one share, one vote. Those things have to be seen in terms of the real problem they're providing. This is not just, we need a little bit better distribution or we need to help poor people. This is a system that really goes to the core. And so the question is, what is the alternative? If the problem is this top-down economy that's run by CEOs and the interests of the shareholders, we'll have to think about an economy that's run via the interests of the workers. And cooperatives here, of course, come to mind. Now, that doesn't mean that just saying cooperatives is already the solution. This takes a lot of work. I learned this from the co-op developers. My partner, Rosemary Henkel-Rieger, is working with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. She's one of the founders, and they're doing this cooperative work, but this time they're doing it with a social analysis. So this is not just let's have co-ops, but this is we now have co-ops in resistance to the dominant economy. If you don't do this work, there's always something missing. The other thing that our co-op developer friends are doing is they're looking at minority communities. So if you build then a cooperative, not just among people who want work, but say in a Black community, what you're doing, of course, is you're building community power where there is not a whole lot, and you're fighting racism at the same time. But you need analysis for that too. It doesn't necessarily happen automatically. The other piece, and I think this is maybe what some of these earlier co-ops overlooked, once you get into this in terms of the overall forms of oppression, in terms of the broader problems, you then realize you need networks. A co-op by itself is great. There's a lot of good things that can happen. But without a network, the dominant system will always take over. A co-op cannot defeat capitalism by itself. It cannot even provide much of an alternative. So the next thing then, and this is a national and international thing, you have to network these cooperatives so that the people who are in them can not only support each other economically, but they can learn from each other. They have started banking projects where, loan projects where they lend each other money. They collaborate in all kinds of things. So these kinds of networks, I think, is what's really interesting right now. And what we're trying to do in relation to the co-ops as people of faith and faith communities is to link faith communities to this as well. So that further strengthens the cooperatives. But here's the really interesting thing, that also in turn strengthens faith communities. So if you have democratically run businesses, if you have economic democracy, chances are you might have better religious democracies. Chances are you might have better relationships within your churches because so many of our churches are actually run like businesses. That's one of the practical problems. Big donors basically call the shots. What the pastor can say or not say is determined by money. If you plug that into a co-op, I think it goes the other way around. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is co-ops have their own limits, but everything has their limits. Faith communities have their limits. But the thing can be built when we build these broader networks, and faith communities have a role to play here as well.
I want to ask, when we were writing the book, Occupy Religion, you talk about deep solidarity. Would that concept still work today?
So the deep solidarity term is really at the core of everything I do. It came to me at the time we wrote the book during the Occupy Wall Street movement. But I realized there maybe 3 points here. First of all, without solidarity, you cannot change the world. This idea that a few people getting together can change the world, for a while you can do something, but you're more successful, you're more effective, you're more powerful if you build solidarity. And that to me is, of course, one of the big questions, how do we change things? How do we make change? What we're learning looking backwards is that the Jesus movement ultimately was also a solidarity movement. It was not a family-based movement, right? That's pretty clear. Jesus says, who is my mother and my brothers and sisters? Not my biological family, but the ones who are doing the will of God. So that's what made him dangerous. This is why they had to kill him, because he was building a solidarity movement. And the dominant system is afraid of nothing more than of these solidarity movements. A minority group here and there, they can always include. The liberals think inclusion is the ultimate thing. An enlightened empire can be very inclusive, can be very hospitable. All that stuff that we're dreaming about, you just make it more diverse, not a problem. You keep the system. But the solidarity thing here cannot be assimilated as easily. So this is why solidarity is still very relevant. And then, of course, everybody's trying to do their own solidarity thing. On the right, they're trying to do solidarity in terms of false identities, racism, for instance. White supremacy is actually building white solidarity based on false assumptions. It's suggesting to white people that you are supreme, you're superior to everybody else, and therefore white supremacy is for you. But white supremacy hides the fact that the white worker has always more in common with the black worker than with the white boss. White supremacy is there to suggest to the white worker, you have more in common with the white boss. The white academic, you have more in common with the white donor than maybe with the black students or the black groundskeepers and so on. So this right-wing false solidarity, and of course, that works via race, that can work via gender, that can work via religion, nationalism, is very dangerous. How do you defeat it? By building a better solidarity. That's the point of deep solidarity. Now, in the meantime, the liberals do solidarity work too, but there it's mostly morality. It's mostly saying you should be in solidarity. We must do more. We must help poor white and black people or something like that. And it's better to do that than nothing. But as people in imperial struggles around the world have oftentimes realized, if you do not realize that you are in solidarity, not because just of your morality, but because of this deep connection, namely, what kills some kills everybody. An injury to one is an injury to all, is what the unions say, or the Apostle Paul says, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. Here, solidarity is not morality. It's not saying you must be in solidarity. It's simply a reminder, you're in this together. You know, what happens to those folks over here ultimately happens to you. So deep solidarity is precisely that deep dive to see what's happening to people. You go to the point where the pressure is greatest. That's where you learn how the system works, and then you work together. The beauty of it is you don't need conservative false solidarity that's built on sameness. You don't need the liberal solidarity that's mainly building on moralizing, but you're becoming aware of how deeply we're all connected. And then you don't have to go to sameness. Difference here is something that's not just to be tolerated, but that makes us stronger. If more people realize an injury to one is an injury to all, you have a stronger solidarity. That goes not just for identities, racial identities, gender, sexual, ethnic identities, all that stuff matters. It goes also for religious identities. So interreligious dialogue in deep solidarity doesn't mean we have to figure out how we're all alike. It just means we have to see what our respective religious traditions can contribute to the struggle for liberation, and then appreciate it. Maybe you learn something from each other. But the point here is not to look for sameness. The point is to look for liberation.
You just returned from a trip to Europe. Can you share with us what your colleagues in Europe are thinking about the United States and its policies?
That would be a long conversation. In general, people find it hard to understand, and that includes the conservatives. People think there's some conservative plot going on around the world. To some degree, it is. The right wing in Germany, for instance, take Germany as an example, is definitely growing. But the right wing is the right wing, And even the conservative parties do not want to have anything to do with it. So the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, this right-wing party in Germany, they're excluded from governing with the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, which is like the German Republicans. In other words, even the German Republican types have a limit to how far to the right they can go. That's very interesting. And of course, in Europe, you always have options that go further to the left. If somebody thinks the Democratic Party or Bernie Sanders or AOC, as far as it goes, look at Europe. There's a lot more going on. I was working actually this time, one of the things I did work with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin, which is the cultural foundation of the left party. And there's an interesting conversation between people on the left, working class people, and religion. This is something that's gradually happening in the US too, but it's hard for us to understand because we usually think in terms of the culture wars. In other words, those of us who are stuck in the culture wars, of course, find it hard to see how broad the European perspective is. And what people see there, I think, is that while the current situation is hard for them to understand in the US in terms of basically everything, how the legal system functions or doesn't function, how politics works in a two-party system and all of this. On the other hand, I think they're also figuring out how different they are. And so in that sense, they might have a hard time understanding what the US is about. But they have some ways of doing stuff that we could learn from. I think that's the interesting conversation. And what I've seen in Europe this time, I've been there 3 weeks, gave 9 lectures at 6 universities and institutions. There's some real progressive spirit emerging. Europe has its own right-wing stuff, don't get me wrong. But there is some real progressive moment, some progressive awakening even, if you want to look at it like that. Some of that might be happening here, but the old idea that Europe is just some old white guys, Eurocentrism and all of this, these things are changing. I think Europe has learned some lessons from fascism, from its colonial past, that we still have to learn in the United States.
Are your colleagues concerned about what the Trump administration is doing to the universities, seizing fundings, and also stopping Harvard from enrolling international students?
Definitely. It's hard to wrap your mind around from Europe what that even means. To be honest, it's hard to wrap your mind around in the United States because I did not learn in history that presidents had the power just to do to universities whatever they wanted to. That's an odd kind of thing, even in US history. There are not that many presidents. So yeah, the Europeans are definitely scratching their heads. But keep in mind, universities in Europe, back to Germany here as an example, all of them are basically government-run universities. There's a few private universities, but it's not like the US. And the best and the strongest universities are the public universities in Germany and most of Europe, which, of course, I think gives them a little bit better connection to the public. Maybe this is the problem of our private universities here, that we've privatized it to such a degree that ultimately the public doesn't care. They think this is just for some elites. And some people are probably pretty happy that the elites are getting checked these days. That doesn't excuse the situation, but I think we could learn something from universities that are from the get-go much more engaged in the public concern and the public interest.
Can you share with us, you are director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. And what does this program do?
So a lot of the work that I've been talking about is located in this Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice, and people can actually check it out. Our website is Religion and Justice, just one word, religionandjustice.org. We say we're focusing on economic and ecological justice in relation to religion. First of all, those are our focal points. And in this regard, I think we're the only program of its kind because we're dealing with economics broadly, as we said, not just the economy, but also working people, labor. We're connected to unions, we're connected to cooperative development and so on. But keep in mind, and this is what people often overlook, what we're doing here is always intersectional. So we're not just interested in economy and ecology, but we're interested in how these kinds of things have to do with all the rest rest of our life. As I said earlier, if you want to fight racism and you build a worker cooperative in a Black community, that's a way to really build some power. That's a way to really make some difference. So these are conversations that we're interested in. And we're doing that in various ways. We're doing academic work, so we're doing research. My Theology in the Capitalocene book is part of that academic conversation. We have some community organizers. Dr. Ernst Stauffer is working with us, broad-based community organizing. We do some chaplaincy work. All that is located in the program. So there's academic work, but we also do a lot of popular education because we think the work really has to be done where it counts. So we work with faith communities. We work with other kinds of movements that go in that direction. And we have a program that's called Solidarity Circles. That means in these circles, we're putting individual faith communities and projects of the solidarity economy together. So it could be as little as a community garden. We have a church here, community garden there. And then we're interested in what's the two-way street here? How does the community garden or a worker co-op, ideally, how does a worker co-op reshape the church? What can a church contribute to a worker co-op? That's not just for churches. It could be other faith communities. We're also open to interfaith. And then we put these projects together in cohorts of about 10 or 12 who spent 9 months together. Well, they meet once a month via Zoom because they're all over the country and some international. Compare notes, what's going on, do theological reflection, do social analysis, empire analysis, talk about Jesus, talk about what's really dear to their hearts, their values, and then network them to build power. We've worked with about 200 churches at this point, and we're starting some new cohorts in the fall. So if anybody is interested, check out religionandjustice.org on our website, the Solidarity Circles.
Thank you very much for joining me today. Best wishes to your work. If you like this episode, please subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks, Pui Lan. It's been good to be with you.